The glass shattered inward at exactly 0147 hours. Rachel Brennan was checking the morphine logs when the first window exploded, spraying frozen shards across Warby like shrapnel from an IED. The lights died a half-second later. Not a surge, not a flicker, but a clean kill. Someone had cut the main line. Professional. She dropped flat behind the medication cart before her conscious mind finished processing the sound. Muscle memory. The kind that doesn't fade no matter how many years you spend pretending you're someone else. Gunfire erupted from 3 directions, short, controlled bursts. Not spray and pray. These weren't local militiamen, hopped up on cot and bravado. These were trained operators executing a coordinated breach. Rachel pressed her back against the cold plywood wall and counted muzzle flashes through the canvas partition. 8 shooters. Maybe 9. Entry points at the east loading dock, the main entrance, and the pharmacy window. Classic 3-prong assault designed to overwhelm and fragment. 26 patients lay in beds throughout the converted grain warehouse. 14 were ambulatory. 8 were critical. 4 were sedated and couldn't move if the building caught fire. She had approximately 90 seconds before the shooters finished clearing the perimeter and moved the interior wards. Rachel Brennan was a night shift nurse at FOB Kestrel. She had been for 11 months. She checked vitals, administered medication, changed dressings, and documented everything in triplicate because that's what nurses did. She wore scrubs. She kept her hair pinned back. She called patients sir and ma'am and spoke in a calm, measured tone they trained you to use in nursing school. But beneath the scrubs, beneath the calm voice, beneath 11 months of deliberate reinvention, Rachel Brennan was something else entirely. If that opening hooked you, buckle up. This story only gets more intense. Subscribe now for more real stories of courage and hit that notification bell. Drop a comment and tell me where you're listening from. Now, let me take you back to where this night really began. 6 hours earlier, FOB Kestrel had been quiet. The blizzard had rolled in from the northwest at approximately 1900 hours, dropping visibility to 15 meters and temperatures to negative 18 Celsius. Supply helicopters were grounded. The mountain roads were impassable. For the next 72 hours, according to meteorological projections, FOB Kestrel was cut off from the rest of the world. Rachel had clocked in at 2200 for the night shift, standard 12-hour rotation. Dr. Webb had finished his rounds by 2330, leaving her alone with 26 patients, a propane heater that wheezed like an emphysema case, and the endless paperwork that kept military medicine functioning. The patients called FOB Kestrel the last stop. It wasn't meant as a compliment. The facility was a converted grain warehouse, corrugated metal roof, plywood walls, canvas partitions separating the wards, and surgical lights hanging from chains that swayed whenever the wind gusted hard enough to shake the foundation. 2 operating rooms. 40 beds. A pharmacy the size of a broom closet. It smelled like kerosene and disinfectant. It sounded like propane heaters struggling against sub-zero cold and the wet rattle of patients fighting pneumonia. It felt like the edge of nowhere, which was exactly what was a nameless conflict zone identified only by grid coordinates because no one had bothered to put on a map. Rachel made her rounds at 0100. Blood pressure checks. Temperature readings. For adjustments. The routine was mechanical, repetitive, and exactly what she needed. Structure without thought. Movement without memory. She was checking Sergeant Morrison's drainage tube when she noticed the first anomaly. The radio on her hip crackled with static. Not unusual during a blizzard. Atmospheric interference played havoc with comms. But this static had a pattern. 3 seconds of dead air, then a burst of white noise, then silence. Repeating. Like someone was selectively jamming specific frequencies while leaving others open. Rachel paused. Her hand tightened on the drainage tube. Old instincts. Old training. The kind you couldn't scrub away with nursing school and good intentions. She keyed her radio and tried raising Outpost River, the QRF station 12 clicks to the south. Nothing but that same pattern static. She tried the guard tower 50 meters west of the hospital. Same result. But when she switched to the civilian emergency band, clear signal, no interference. Someone was jamming military frequencies while leaving civilian bands untouched. That took equipment. That took planning. That took someone who knew exactly what they were doing. Rachel set down the drainage tube and walked to the window at the end of Ward A. The blizzard was a wall of white beyond the glass. Visibility was effectively zero, but she could see the guard tower spotlight sweeping the perimeter, a yellow smear cutting through the snow every 38 to 42 seconds. She counted 3 rotations. 38, 41, 39. Standard security protocol called for 30-second intervals. Consistent, predictable. The variance meant either equipment malfunction or human error, or someone had compromised the tower and was running the light manually, unable to match the program timing. Rachel's stomach tightened. She walked to the east-facing window and pressed her palm against the frozen glass. Outside, somewhere in the darkness, motion sensors lined perimeter. They were designed to trigger silent alarms if anything larger than a fox crossed a detection field. 3 alarms had triggered in the past hour. She checked the security log when the second one pinged. The duty officer had dismissed them as weather interference. Ice particles, snow accumulation, thermal fluctuation. But it was negative 18 degrees outside. Nothing moved in weather this cold. No animals, no debris. The ground was frozen solid, and the wind was driving horizontally, not stirring up loose material. Something was out there. Multiple somethings, moving in coordinated patterns, triggering sensors, testing response times. Rachel stood at that window for a long moment, her breath fogging the glass. She could report her suspicions. Wake Dr. Webb. Alert the duty officer. Follow protocol. But protocol meant explaining how a night shift nurse recognized the signature of a planned assault. Protocol meant questions she couldn't answer. Without revealing 18 months of training, she'd spent 3 years trying to forget. 3 years ago, Rachel Brennan had been someone else. She'd worn desert camouflage instead of scrubs. She carried an M40A6 instead of a stethoscope. Her call sign was Falcon, and she'd spent 18 months embedded with Marine Scout Sniper Team in some of the most hostile terrain on the planet. 47 confirmed kills. That was her number. 47 enemy combatants eliminated at ranges between 200 and 800 meters. Clean shots. Professional work. The kind of record that got you commendations and promotions and quiet nods from men who understood exactly what that number meant. She'd been good at it. That was the part that haunted her most. Not that she'd done it, but that she'd been good at it. Natural, even, something in the way her heartbeat steadied when she settled behind the scope. Something in the way her breathing slowed to nothing as she calculated windage and elevation. Something that felt less like training and more like instinct. Her spotter had called her a prodigy. Her team leader had called her an asset. The Marines had called her one of the most promising snipers in the Corps. And then there was Kandahar. Rachel rarely let herself think about Kandahar. The memory lived in a locked room in her mind. Behind walls, she spent 3 years reinforcing with nursing textbooks and patient charts and the deliberate mundanity of civilian life. But standing at that frozen window in FOB Kestrel, counting compromised motion sensors and jam frequencies, the walls were starting to crack. She'd been on Overwatch, rooftop position, 300 meters from a market street, where Intel said a high-value target would be meeting with local bomb makers. She had clear line of sight, clear shot, clear orders. The man in her crosshairs had been carrying a package wrapped in brown cloth. He'd been moving with purpose toward the designated meeting point. He'd matched the physical description in the briefing packet. Rachel had taken the shot, 297 meters. Center mass. The man had dropped before the sound of the round reached the street. Standard elimination. Clean work. Exactly what she'd been trained to do. And then a 7-year-old girl had run out of the shop behind him, screaming. She'd thrown herself over the body, her hands covered in her father's blood, and she'd screamed and screamed and screamed until someone finally pulled her away. 3 days later, intelligence revised their assessment. Wrong target. The man Rachel had killed was a shopkeeper named Hamid Khalil. He'd been carrying fabric samples to a tailor, not explosive components to a bomb maker. His daughter's name was Amira. She was 7 years old, and she would grow up without a father because Rachel Brennan had done exactly what she was trained to do. Rachel had submitted her discharge papers that night. Medical evaluation, psychological trauma, honorable discharge, no questions asked. She'd enrolled in nursing school 6 months later. If she couldn't undo what she'd done, she could at least spend the rest of her life trying to balance the scales. For every life she'd taken, she would save another. For every wound she'd inflicted, she would heal one. It was a transaction that could never complete. She knew that. The math didn't work. You couldn't resurrect the dead by saving the living. Couldn't give Amira Khalil her father back by treating patients in a converted grain warehouse at the edge of nowhere. But the work itself was something. The routine, the structure, the daily proof that she was capable of preservation instead of destruction. Rachel Brennan had been a nurse for 3 years. She was reliable, competent. Colleagues trusted her. Patients respected her. She moved through her shifts with mechanical precision. Never too fast, never too slow, always exactly what the job required. She had promised herself that she would never pull another trigger, that the woman who could calculate windage and elevation by instinct, who could slow her heartbeat to nothing while lining up a kill shot, that woman was dead, buried, gone. But standing at that window, counting the signatures of an imminent attack, Rachel could feel her rising from the grave. The gunfire at 0147 confirmed everything. Rachel dropped behind the medication cart and let her mind shift into a mode she'd spent 3 years trying to forget. Threat assessment, tactical analysis, survival probability calculation, 8 shooters, coordinated entry, professional spacing, estimated time to interior penetration, 90 seconds, maybe less. Primary targets, medical supplies, narcotics, possibly hostages for leverage. Secondary probability, elimination of witnesses. The patients couldn't defend themselves. Most of them couldn't even move. They were helpless, vulnerable, dependent entirely on the staff of a field hospital that was currently under armed assault in a blizzard that had cut off all possibility of reinforcement. Rachel had 2 options. She could hide, find a supply closet, barricade the door, wait for the attack to end. If the insurgents were after supplies rather than casualties, she might survive. She could emerge afterward, play the traumatized nurse, answer questions with shaking hands and a terrified voice. She could preserve the lies she'd built for 3 years. Or she could do what needed to be done. 26 patients, 8 shooters, 1 former sniper who had promised herself she would never kill again. Rachel closed her eyes and saw Amira Khalil's face, saw her father's blood on small hands, heard the screaming that lived in the locked room of her mind. She had sworn to herself, sworn on the memory of Hamid Khalil, sworn on the daughter she'd orphaned, that she would never take another life, that her hands would heal, not harm, that the scales would tip toward redemption, not sink deeper into blood. But those 26 patients would die if she did nothing. Sergeant Morrison with his drainage tube, Private Chun with the shrapnel wounds that were finally starting to close, Corporal Williams who had just called his daughter for the first time since deployment. They would all die, every single one of them, and Rachel would survive, hiding in her supply closet, keeping her promise to a dead shopkeeper while 26 living men bled out on plywood floors. The choice wasn't a choice. It was a calculation, and the math was brutal. Rachel moved. She dropped to her hands and knees and crawled through Ward B, staying below the windows, moving between beds with the practiced silence of someone who had once moved through hostile territory for a living. The patients who were conscious watched her with wide eyes, but she held a finger to her lips and they understood. Not a sound, not a whisper. She reached Private Chen's bed and grabbed his arm. "Floor," she whispered. "Get everyone on the floor, below the mattress line. Don't move until I come back." Chen was 19 years old and had shrapnel in his abdomen, but his eyes were clear and his hands were steady. He nodded once and started pulling himself towards Sergeant Morrison's bed. Good. 1 problem managed. 25 more to go. Rachel crawled to the rear of the ward, past the canvas partition that separated recovery from critical care, past the supply cabinet where she'd hidden a tactical flashlight 11 months ago, just in case, always just in case, and reached the back exit. The steel door was designed to seal against weather infiltration. It was heavy, reinforced, and cold enough to burn exposed skin at -18 Celsius. Rachel wrapped her hands in gauze from her pocket and pushed. The blizzard hit her like a wall. Wind sheer at 15 knots from the northwest. Visibility at 15 meters, maybe less. Temperature that turned exposed skin to frostbite in under 10 minutes. She was wearing scrubs, thin-soled nursing shoes, and a gauze wrap around her hands. She had approximately 8 minutes before hypothermia became a factor. Rachel oriented herself against the building's exterior wall and moved south, toward the maintenance ladder she'd mapped 11 months ago when she'd first arrived at FOB Kestrel. Because that's what you did when you were a former sniper pretending to be a nurse. You mapped exits, calculated sight lines, identified high ground positions. Just in case. Always just in case. The ladder was frozen. Ice coated the rungs in a shell that cracked under her weight, but held. She climbed hand over hand, her fingers screaming against the cold, her breath crystallizing in the air in front of her face. The roof was corrugated metal sheeting, laid over wooden beams. Not structural, not designed to hold weight. But Rachel had calculated the load distribution 11 months ago. 240 pounds maximum on the center beams, less toward the edges. She weighed 140. She had margin. She crawled across the roof on her stomach, distributing her weight across the metal sheets, feeling the structure groan beneath her. The wind cut through her scrubs like they weren't there. Her fingers were going numb. Her feet had stopped reporting sensation 2 minutes ago. Below her, inside the hospital, she could hear the shooters moving, shouted commands in a language she didn't recognize. The crash of equipment being overturned. A single scream, quickly silenced. Rachel reached the roof's peak and stopped. From this position, she could see the entire perimeter. The guard tower 50 meters to the west, dark now, compromised. The tree line 100 meters to the northeast, where the overwatch would be positioned if the assault followed standard military doctrine. The hospital's east loading dock, where 3 shapes were crouched behind sandbag positions. And there in the trees, a muzzle flash. Then another. The overwatch was exactly where she'd expected him to be. Elevated position with clear sight lines on all exits. Covering fire for the assault team. Professional placement. Rachel estimated the range at 140 meters. Uphill angle. Blizzard conditions. Wind shear factor of 12 to 15, depending on gust timing. 0 optical enhancement. It was an impossible shot with iron sights. Even with a scope, it would be marginal. Without one, firing into that wind and snow, she'd be lucky to hit the tree, let alone the shooter behind it. But she didn't need to hit him. She needed to blind him. Rachel reached into the maintenance kit strapped to the roof access hatch, the one she'd stocked 11 months ago with supplies that had nothing to do with maintenance. Her fingers, numb and clumsy, closed around the flare gun. Single round. Effective illumination range of 50 meters. She was about to fire it at nearly 3 times that distance. It wouldn't hit the overwatch. It wouldn't even come close. But flare at night was a sun appearing in the darkness, a burst of light that would destroy any shooter's night vision for critical seconds. Rachel lined up the shot by instinct. Wind compensation, elevation, arc trajectory. The calculations happened automatically, without conscious thought, the way her breathing slowed and her heartbeat steady without her telling it to. She was doing it again, becoming the thing she'd promised to bury. The flare arced into the blizzard. It burst 60 meters short of the tree line, but the light was blinding, a phosphorescent sun in the white darkness that turned the snow into a wall of pure luminescence. The overwatch would be seeing spots for the next 30 to 45 seconds. His effective range had just dropped to 0. Rachel didn't wait to watch. She was already moving, sliding down the maintenance ladder, hitting the frozen ground hard enough to jar her teeth. The cold was past painful now. It was a full-body numbness that made movement feel like swimming through concrete. She had maybe 4 minutes before her muscles stopped responding. The rear door was still ajar. She pushed through it, back into the relative warmth of the hospital's interior, and pressed herself against the wall. The gunfire had stopped. The shooters were inside now, moving through the wards, searching. Rachel heard one of them, 30 feet away, on the other side of the canvas partition. He was speaking into a radio, reporting something. His voice was calm, professional. She looked at her hands. Pale, shaking, still wrapped in gauze that was now soaked with ice melt. These were nurses' hands. Healers' hands. Hands that had sutured wounds and administered medication and held dying patients through their final moments. These were also snipers' hands. Killers' hands. Hands that had sent 47 men to their graves at distances most people couldn't even conceptualize. Rachel flexed her fingers. The numbness was fading as warmth returned. Sensation crawled back into her joints. She could still walk away, find that supply closet, barricade the door, survive. But she could hear Private Chen's voice somewhere in the darkness, pleading, desperate, and she could hear the shooter's response. A laugh, then a sound that might have been a rifle but hitting flesh. Rachel moved toward the sound. The darkness was nearly total. Power to the main grid had been severed, and the backup generator hadn't kicked in, either damaged in the initial assault or deliberately disabled. The only light came from tactical flashlights mounted on the shooter's weapons, slicing through the darkness in harsh white beams. Rachel had spent 18 months learning to move without light, learning to feel her way through hostile terrain by memory and instinct, learning to navigate by sound and shadow and the subtle displacement of air that told you something solid was close. The shooter was 20 feet ahead of her, his flashlight beam pointed at the floor where Private Chen lay prone with his hands over his head. The shooter was saying something, giving orders, demanding information, but Rachel wasn't listening to the words. She was counting his breathing rate, his stance width, the angle of his weapon, the distance between them, the time it would take him to turn and fire if he heard her approach. 3 seconds, maybe 4. She needed 2. Rachel closed the distance in absolute silence. Her nursing shoes, soft-soled, designed for long shifts on hard floors, made no sound on the plywood. Her breathing was controlled, shallow, automatic. The shooter didn't turn, didn't hear, didn't know. She struck his knee from behind with the edge of her foot, a precise blow to the lateral collateral ligament that dropped him before he could process what was happening. His rifle swung up reflexively, but she was already inside his guard, her hands closing on the weapon, twisting it out of his grip with a motion that was pure muscle memory. AK pattern rifle, 30-round magazine, safety off, iron sights. The shooter tried to rise. Rachel drove her knee into his solar plexus and felt the air leave his lungs. He collapsed, gasping, and she brought the rifle stock down on the back of his skull. He went still, not dead, unconscious. Rachel could have killed him, should have killed him by any tactical calculus, but her hands refused emotion. 47 kills were enough. 47 ghosts were enough. She grabbed the shooter's tactical vest and dragged him into the shadow beneath an operating table. Zip-tied his hands with supplies from his own kit. Checked his pulse, strong, steady. He'd wake up with a concussion and a story to tell. Private Chen was staring at her. His eyes were wide in the darkness, gleaming with reflected light from somewhere down the corridor. "Stay down," Rachel whispered. "Don't move until I come back." Chen nodded, didn't speak, didn't ask questions. Good. Rachel moved through the hospital like a ghost. Her bare feet, she'd kicked off the nursing shoes somewhere between the operating room and Ward A, made no sound on the cold floor. The AK was heavy in her hands, heavier than the M40A6 she'd carried for 18 months, but the weight was familiar. The grip was familiar. The cold metal against her skin was familiar. She was doing it again, becoming it again. The backup generator was in a reinforced shed 40 meters from the main building. She'd mapped it 11 months ago, noted the access points, calculated the time required to reach it from any position in the hospital. 32 seconds at a dead sprint. 45 if she was careful. Rachel chose careful. The shooters had spread through the building. She could track their positions by flashlight beams and shouted communications. 7 total, now that she'd taken one out. They were searching systematically, moving ward by ward, probably looking for the narcotics cabinet or high-value hostages. They weren't expecting resistance. Why would they? This was a field hospital in the middle of a blizzard, staffed by nurses and doctors and support personnel. No combat troops. No armed security. No threat. Rachel reached the exterior door that led to the generator shed. She paused, listened, counted heartbeats. The generator was the key. Kill the generator, and the hospital went dark. The shooters would lose their flashlight advantage. Batteries drained faster in cold weather, and they'd been running hard since the breach. Without backup power, without their lights, they'd be operating blind in unfamiliar terrain. Rachel knew the terrain. She'd mapped every inch of it. She pushed through the door and sprinted for the generator shed. The cold hit her like a physical force, -18 and dropping, wind chill pushing it toward -30. Her scrubs offered no protection. Her bare feet screamed against the frozen ground. The shed door was unlocked. She pulled it open, located the main breaker by touch, and threw it. The generator's hum died. The lights inside the hospital, the emergency strips that had kicked on when the main power failed, went dark. Total blackout. Rachel could hear the shouting from inside. Confusion. Disorientation. The shooters had just lost their tactical advantage. She had maybe 90 seconds before they reorganized. Rachel moved around the exterior of the hospital, staying close to the walls, using the building's bulk to shield her from the Overwatch position in the tree line. He'd be recovering his night vision now. The flare's effect would be fading. She needed to neutralize him before he regained his effectiveness. The storage shed was 30 meters from the main building. Elevated position on a slight rise. Clear sight lines to the tree line. Not perfect cover, but better than nothing. Rachel climbed onto the shed's roof and went prone. The AK's iron sights were crude compared to the optics she'd trained with, but the range was short. 30 meters to the tree line, maybe 35. At that distance, iron sights were sufficient. She could see him now. A shadow among shadows, barely visible against the snow-covered trees. But she knew what to look for. She'd been trained to find concealed positions at ranges 10 times this distance. The Overwatch was shifting, trying to reacquire his sight picture after the flare's disruption. He was good, professional, disciplined, well-positioned, but he wasn't good enough. Rachel slowed her breathing, felt her heartbeat drop, felt the familiar calm settle over her like a shroud. Windage, negligible at this range. Elevation, slight upward compensation. Target movement, minimal. He was settling into position. The calculations happened without thought. Muscle memory, instinct, the part of her that had never really died. No matter how many nursing shifts she worked, no matter how many patients she saved. She lined up the shot. Center mass, 30 meters. Iron sights. Her finger tightened on the trigger. The rifle kicked against her shoulder with a familiar violence. One shot. Single round. The sound cracked across the frozen landscape like a whip, absorbed by the blizzard within seconds. In the tree line, the shadow collapsed. Rachel didn't move, didn't breathe, watched through the swirling snow as the shape crumpled and stayed down. No return fire. No secondary movement. Clean hit. 48. The number surfaced in her mind unbidden. 48 confirmed kills. The ledger had been 47 for 3 years. Frozen static, the final count of a life she'd left behind. Now it was 48. Hamid Khalil was still dead. Amira Khalil still had no father. The scales hadn't shifted. Nothing had been redeemed. But 26 patients were still breathing inside that hospital, and the man who had killed them was bleeding out in the snow. Rachel felt nothing. Not satisfaction. Not guilt. Not the horror that should accompany taking a human life. Just a cold, mechanical emptiness that came when training took over, and the person you'd built yourself in stepped aside for the person you'd always been. She was shaking. Not from cold. The numbness had progressed past the point of sensation. She was shaking because her body remembered what this felt like. The adrenaline dump. The post-shot tremor. The strange, hollow silence that followed a kill. Below her, inside the hospital, the remaining 7 shooters were panicking. She could hear it in their communications, shouted fragments in a language she still didn't recognize, but the tone was universal. Confusion, fear. Their Overwatch was down. The lights were dead. Someone among their targets was shooting back, and they didn't know who or where. Professional assault teams train for contingencies. They train to adapt, to reorganize, to press forward through unexpected resistance. But these men weren't expecting any resistance. They'd come to hit a soft target, a medical facility staffed by unarmed personnel, cut off from reinforcement by a blizzard. They hadn't planned for opposition. They certainly hadn't planned for a former Marine Scout sniper defending the facility from the roof of a storage shed with a captured AK pattern rifle. Rachel watched their flashlight beams slice through the darkness inside the hospital. Erratic now, moving too fast, sweeping too wide, panic movements. She didn't have clear shots on any of them. The walls blocked her sight lines, and she wasn't going to fire blind into a building full of patients. But they didn't know that. They didn't know where the shot had come from, didn't know how many shooters were engaging them, didn't know if they were walking into a crossfire. Uncertainty was a weapon. Fear was a weapon. Rachel chambered another round, the sound carrying across the frozen air, deliberately loud, deliberately theatrical. Let them hear it. Let them wonder. Inside the hospital, the flashlight beam stopped moving. Then, all at once, they started converging, moving toward the east loading dock, moving toward their extraction point. They were running. Rachel watched them go. 7 shadows fleeing into the blizzard, their coordinated assault dissolving into a scramble for survival. They didn't bother collecting their overwatch, didn't bother searching for their unconscious teammate. They just ran, disappearing into the white darkness like they'd never been there at all. Rachel stayed prone on the storage shed roof for another 3 minutes, counting, watching, making sure. No secondary assault, no regrouping, no return fire. The attack was over. Rachel lowered the rifle and let herself breathe. Her hands were shaking badly now, the adrenaline crash combining with hypothermia to turn her motor control into a trembling mess. She needed to get inside, needed to warm up before the cold damage became permanent. She slid off the shed roof and nearly collapsed when her feet hit the ground. Her legs had stopped responding properly. The cold had penetrated past skin, past muscle, into the bone. She staggered toward the hospital, the AK dragging in the snow behind her. The rear door was still ajar. She pushed through it and felt the relative warmth hit her like a wave. 40 degrees warmer than the exterior, maybe more. Still cold by any normal standard, but to her frozen body, it felt like stepping into a furnace. Rachel dropped the rifle and leaned against the wall. Her breath came in ragged gasps. Her vision was tunneling at the edges. Hypothermia. Moderate to severe. She needed to warm her core before the shaking progressed to cardiac arrhythmia. She forced herself to move, down the corridor, toward the supply cabinet. The hospital was silent now. No gunfire, no shouting, just a whistle of wind through broken windows and the distant groan of the building settling against the storm. Rachel? The voice came from her left. Dr. Webb, emerging from behind an overturned gurney, with blood on his hands and terror in his eyes. "They're gone," Rachel said. Her voice sounded strange to her own ears. "Flat, dead. Check the patients. Assess casualties." Webb stared at her. His gaze dropped to her feet, bare, blue with cold, leaving bloody footprints on the floor. Then to her hands, still wrapped in gauze, still trembling. Then to her face, and whatever he saw there made him take a step back. "Rachel, what?" Later, she pushed past him toward the supply cabinet. Patients first. She found a thermal blanket and wrapped it around her shoulders. Found chemical hand warmers and crushed them against her palms. Found the backup radio, the one she'd stashed in the cabin 11 months ago, tuned to a frequency the insurgent jammers weren't blocking. "Outpost River. This is FOB Kestrel. We have casualties. Request immediate QRF when weather permits." "How copy?" Static. Then a voice, young, confused, half asleep. "FOB Kestrel, say again? We lost your signal an hour ago. Thought you were... We were under attack. 8 hostiles plus Overwatch. Coordinated assault at 0147. Attack repelled. Multiple wounded. Request QRF at first opportunity." "Roger, Kestrel. QRF staging now, but weather's still red for air assets. Earliest window is 0630. For hours." Rachel closed her eyes. "Copy, River. Kestrel out." She set down the radio and turned back toward the wards. Dr. Webb was standing in the doorway, watching her with an expression she couldn't read. Behind him, Nurse Thompson was slumped against the wall with blood soaking her left shoulder, through and through wound, probably from the initial breach, but she was conscious and her color was good. "Everyone else?" Rachel asked. "All accounted for." Webb's voice was careful, controlled. 26 patients, all stable. Thompson's the only casualty besides. He trailed off. His eyes went to the darkness outside, where the Overwatch's body was cooling in the snow. "Besides the hostiles," Rachel finished. Webb nodded slowly. "Besides the hostiles." The next 4 hours were a blur of triage and stabilization. Rachel worked mechanically, her body operating on autopilot, while her mind stayed locked in a state of protective numbness. She sutured Thompson's shoulder wound. Clean entry, clean exit, no arterial involvement. She rechecked every patient in the hospital, documenting vitals, confirming no secondary injuries. She restored power from the backup generator and swept the facility for any hostiles who might have stayed behind. She found the one she'd knocked unconscious, exactly where she'd left him, still breathing, still zip-tied. She dragged him to the secure storage room and locked the door. Dr. Webb watched her do all of this without saying a word. At 0500, Rachel finally allowed herself to sit down. The thermal blanket was still wrapped around her shoulders. The chemical warmers had long since cooled. Her feet were in a basin of warm water, slowly regaining sensation as the cold damage reversed. Webb sat down across from her. "You want to tell me what happened out there?" Rachel stared at the water in the basin. It was tinged pink with blood from her feet, cuts from the frozen ground, nothing serious. "Insurgent assault," she said. "Coordinated. Professional. They hit the power first, breached through multiple entry points. I moved patients to cover and waited for it to end. And the overwatch in the trees?" Rachel's hands tightened on the edge of the basin. "Lucky shot. Someone must have grabbed one of their weapons during confusion. Panic fire. Hit him by accident." Webb was silent for a long moment. "I've been a combat surgeon for 12 years, he said finally. "I've seen panic fire. I've seen lucky shots. That wasn't either." Rachel didn't respond. "Single round, center mass, from what looks like 40 meters in a blizzard." Webb's voice was quiet. "Careful. That's not luck, Rachel. That's training. I don't know what you're talking about." "I think you do." Rachel looked up at him. Her eyes were flat, empty, the eyes of someone who had long since stopped expecting understanding. "You have a theory, doctor. I'd recommend keeping it to yourself." Webb held her gaze for a moment. Then he nodded slowly and stood up. "I'm going to check on the patients." He paused at the doorway. "Whoever you used to be, Rachel, thank you. You saved 26 lives tonight." He left. Rachel sat alone in the silence, her feet slowly warming in the basin, her mind replaying the shot over and over again. 30 meters, iron sights, center mass. She could still feel the rifle's kick against her shoulder, could still smell the gunpowder, could still see the shadow collapse in the tree line. 48. The number would follow her now, would live in the locked room with Hamid Khalil and his daughter, and all the other ghosts she'd accumulated over 18 months of professional killing. 48 men who would never go home. 48 families who would never see their fathers, sons, brothers again. 48 lives ended by her hands. And 26 lives saved. Rachel tried to make the math work. Tried to find some equation that balanced the scales, that proved tonight was different from Kandahar, that killing in defense was different from killing by mistake. But the math didn't work. It never had. 47 had been too many. 48 wasn't redemption. It was one more weight added to a burden that was already crushing her. The Overwatch had a family somewhere. Parents who would wonder what happened to their son. Maybe a wife. Maybe children of his own. They would never know the truth. Would never know that their father had died 30 meters from a storage shed, shot by a night nurse who had once been something else. Rachel pulled her feet out of the basin and dried them carefully. The cuts were superficial. They would heal. The rest of her wouldn't. Dawn came slowly to FOB Kestrel. The blizzard was beginning to fade, wind dropping from 15 knots to 10, visibility improving from 15 meters to 30. By 0630, the sky was a pale gray wash over mountains, and the thrum of helicopter rotors echoed through the valley. The QRF landed in a whirlwind of snow and efficiency. 12 armed soldiers deploying in tactical formation, sweeping the perimeter, securing the facility. Medical personnel rushing in with fresh supplies and evacuation equipment. Rachel watched it all from the window of the supply closet. She'd changed out of her blood-stained scrubs into fresh ones, had washed the grime from her face and hands, had pinned her hair back into its regulation style. From the outside, she looked like exactly what she was supposed to be, a night shift nurse who had survived a traumatic incident. The military investigators arrived at 0715. Captain Marcus Hayes, Criminal Investigation Division. Square jaw, gray eyes, the particular intensity of someone who had built a career on finding the truth. Nurse Brennan. He consulted a tablet. Walk me through what happened. Rachel had rehearsed this, had run through the story a dozen times while she waited for dawn. I was doing my rounds when the attack started. Glass breaking. Gunfire. The lights went out. I moved to the supply closet and barricaded myself inside. I stayed there until the shooting stopped. Hayes made a note. You didn't see any of the attackers? Glimpses. Shadows. I was focused on staying hidden. And you didn't engage any of them? I'm a nurse, Captain. I don't carry weapons. Hayes's eyes narrowed slightly. We found a captured hostile in the secure storage room, zip-tied with professional restraints. Someone knocked him unconscious with what appears to be a rifle-stock blow to the skull. Rachel kept her expression neutral. One of the patients is former military, Sergeant Morrison. He's ambulatory despite his injuries. It's possible Sergeant Morrison was sedated during the attack. His foe was delivering a morphine drip that would have kept him unconscious through anything short of an explosion. Rachel said nothing. Hayes studied her for a long moment. We also found an overwatch position in the tree line. Single hostile, deceased, shot through the center mass at approximately 30 meters. Lucky shot, Rachel said. Panic fire from one of the stolen weapons. Forensics says the shot was textbook. Single round, no scattered casings, perfect placement. That's not panic fire, Nurse Brennan. That's precision shooting. Rachel met his gaze and held it. I was in the supply closet, Captain. I don't know who took that shot. I'm just grateful they did. Hayes's jaw tightened. He knew she was lying. She knew he knew. But knowledge and proof were different things, and there was nothing in the physical evidence that contradicted her story. One more question. Hayes leaned forward slightly. Your service record shows you were honorably discharged from the Marines 3 years ago. Medical evaluation. Psychological trauma. Rachel's blood went cold. Your MOS is listed as classified. Hayes's voice was very quiet. I had to get 3 signatures just to access the file header. I still can't read the contents. That information isn't relevant to Nurse Brennan. Hayes cut her off. I've been doing this for 15 years. I know what a classified MOS means. And I know what a 30-meter precision shot in blizzard conditions means. Rachel didn't blink, didn't breathe. So here's what I'm going to do. Hayes closed his tablet. I'm going to write in my report that the Overwatch was killed by a lucky ricochet. I'm going to write that the captured hostile was subdued by an unknown patient who regained consciousness during the attack. And I'm going to recommend that you receive a commendation for your calm and professional conduct during a crisis situation. Rachel stared at him. Why? Because 26 patients are alive this morning who would be dead if someone hadn't done exactly what needed to be done. Hayes stood up. I don't know who you used to be, Brennan, and I don't particularly care. All I know is that someone defended this hospital last night, and that someone saved a lot of lives. He paused at the door. Sometimes the right thing to do isn't the thing you're supposed to do. Sometimes it's the thing that keeps people breathing. Whoever took that shot, they made the right call. He left. Rachel sat alone in the supply closet, staring at the wall, feeling nothing at all. The evacuation took most of the morning. Helicopters shuttled patients to better equipped facilities down the mountain. Thompson was medevaced first. Her shoulder wound was stable but required surgery she couldn't get at FOB Kestrel. The critical patients followed, then the ambulatory ones, then the staff. Rachel supervised the transfers with mechanical efficiency, checked vitals, updated charts, made sure every patient was accounted for and properly handed off. Dr. Webb found her as the last helicopter lifted off, leaving FOB Kestrel empty except for the cleanup crews. You're being transferred. His voice was flat, carefully neutral. Orders came through an hour ago. New assignment at a field hospital near the eastern border. Rachel nodded. She'd expected this. The military preferred to move problems rather than solve them. When do I leave? Tonight. Transport's already arranged. Webb stood beside her, watching the helicopter disappear over the mountains. The blizzard had cleared completely now. The sky was a brilliant, painful blue. I've been thinking, Webb said slowly, about what you told Captain Hayes. Rachel tensed. About how you were hiding in the supply closet. About how someone else took those shots. It's what happened. Webb was quiet for a moment. Then he sighed. I've been a doctor for 23 years. 12 of them in combat zones. I've seen a lot of things that officially never happened. Classified operations, black sites, people who were never where they said they were, doing things that never got written down. Rachel didn't respond. What I've learned is that some questions are better left unasked. Webb turned to face her. And some people are worth protecting, even when they don't think they deserve it. I don't. You saved 26 lives last night. Webb's voice was firm. I don't know how. I don't know who you used to be. And I'm not going to ask. But whatever you did, whatever it cost you, it mattered. They're going to go home to their families because you did something no one else could do. Rachel felt something crack inside her chest. Not relief, not gratitude. Something older and more fragile. The desperate hope that maybe, somehow, the scales might shift. It doesn't balance, she whispered. The math doesn't work. Webb looked at her with something that might have been compassion. No, he agreed. It doesn't. It never does. But that doesn't mean you stop trying. He reached out and squeezed her shoulder, a brief human contact that made her flinch. Hang up your old life, Rachel. Whatever ghosts you're carrying, you don't have to carry them alone. Rachel looked at him, really looked, for the first time since the attack. I'm trying, she said. I've been trying for 3 years. I know. Webb stepped back. But maybe trying isn't about leaving who you were behind. Maybe it's about figuring out how to be both things at once. He walked away, leaving her alone on the empty loading dock. Rachel stood there for a long time, watching the mountains fade into afternoon haze. She thought about Hamid Khalil, about the shopkeeper who had died at 300 meters because she'd followed orders and taken the shot, about his daughter, whose screaming still echoed in her dreams. She thought about the Overwatch, about the man who had died at 30 meters because she refused to let 26 patients die while she hid in a closet. 2 shots, 2 kills, one a mistake, one a necessity. The math didn't work. It never would. But maybe that wasn't the point. Maybe the point was that she kept going anyway, kept working, kept saving the people she could save, knowing it would never be enough, knowing the scales would never balance, knowing the ghosts would never stop following her. Sutures instead of bullets, saving instead of taking, the transaction that could never complete. But the work itself was something, the routine, the structure, the daily proof that she was still capable of choosing preservation over destruction. Rachel wasn't a nurse who used to be a sniper. She was a sniper who happened to work as a nurse. The two couldn't be separated, couldn't be amputated like a gangrenous limb. They were both her, the healer and the killer, the woman who saved lives and the woman who took them, the person she'd built and the person she'd been born as. She would carry them both, forever, because the alternative was worse. The transport helicopter arrived at 1800 hours. Rachel climbed aboard with a single duffel bag and a classified personnel file that would follow her to her next assignment. The pilot didn't ask questions. The crew chief didn't make conversation. She watched FOB Kestrel shrink beneath her as the helicopter climbed. The converted grain warehouse. The tree line where the Overwatch had died. The storage shed where she'd taken a shot. That changed everything. By morning, she'd be at a new facility. New patients. New colleagues, new people who would know her only as a night shift nurse who was reliable, competent, and deliberately isolated. They would never know about Kandahar, about Falcon, about the 48 men who had died by her hands. They would never know about the night a sniper had defended a hospital in a blizzard, killing 1 man to save 26. Rachel closed her eyes and let the helicopter carry her toward whatever came next. The new facility was called FOB Mercer. It was built from shipping containers welded together into a maze of corridors and wards, staffed by overworked surgeons and exhausted nurses, located in a valley that saw combat every other week. Dr. Sarah Chun was a chief surgeon. She met Rachel at the landing pad with a handshake and a weary smile. Nurse Brennan, we're glad to have you. Your transfer file says you have experience in austere environments. Yes, ma'am. Good. Because this is about as austere as it gets. Chun gestured toward the facility. We're understaffed, undersupplied, and overworked. I hope you're ready to hit the ground running. Rachel looked at the containers, at the sandbag fortifications, at the guard towers marking the perimeter. I'm ready. Chun nodded and started walking toward the facility. Rachel fell into step beside her. "One more thing," Chin said as they reached the entrance. "I heard about what happened at FOB Kestrel, the insurgent attack." Rachel's stomach tightened. "The official report says you hid in a supply closet and waited for it to end." Chen's voice was carefully neutral. "It also says 26 patients survived an assault that should have killed everyone in the building. It was a chaotic situation. A lot of things happened that aren't in the report." Chin stopped and turned to face her. "I spent 10 years in Navy SEAL medical support. I've worked with people who have classified histories and complicated pasts. I don't ask questions I don't need answered." Rachel met her gaze. "What I do need to know," Chin continued, "is whether you can handle yourself if something happens here. Whether you can keep patients alive when everything goes wrong." Rachel thought about the blizzard, about the storage shed, about the 30-meter shot that had saved 26 lives. "Yes," she said, "I can." Chin studied her for a long moment. Then she nodded. "Good, because out here things go wrong a lot." She pushed open the door to the facility. "Welcome to FOB Mercer, Nurse Brennan. Try to get some sleep. You start night shift at 2200. Rachel stepped through the door into her new life. The first week at FOB Mercer passed in a blur of routine. Rachel worked her shifts, checked vitals, administered medication, changed dressings, documented everything in triplicate. She learned the layout of the facility, every exit, every sight line, every position that could be defended if necessary. Old habits. The other staff kept their distance. She was a new transfer, the unknown quantity, the nurse who had survived an attack that should have killed everyone. They didn't know what to make of her, and she didn't go out of her way to help them figure out. Isolation was familiar, comfortable. She'd built walls around herself 3 years ago, and she maintained them with professional precision. But at night, when the facility was quiet and the patients were sleeping, Rachel found herself standing at windows, watching the perimeter, counting the interval between guard tower sweeps, noting the patterns in radio traffic, just in case, always just in case. The 8th night, Dr. Chin found her at the window. "Can't sleep?" Rachel shook her head. "Never could during deployments." Deployments? Chin leaned against the wall beside her. "That's a specific word for someone whose file says she's been a civilian nurse for 3 years. Rachel didn't respond. "I'm not fishing," Chin said, "just observing." She was quiet for a moment. "I read between the lines, Brennan. I know what a classified MOS means. I know what a medical discharge for psychological trauma usually covers." "Then you know I don't want to talk about it." "Fair enough." Chin turned to look out the window. "But for what it's worth, whatever you were before, you're a damn good nurse now. Thompson's shoulder wound would have gone septic if you hadn't caught the early signs. Sergeant Williams would have stroked out if you hadn't noticed the BP spike. I was doing my job. You were doing more than that." Chen's voice was soft. "You were paying attention in ways most people don't, seeing things most people miss." Rachel thought about the blizzard, about the jam frequencies and the erratic spotlight timing, and the motion sensors tripping in weather too cold for animals. Sometimes seeing things is a curse. Maybe, Chun pushed off from the wall, but sometimes it's the only thing that keeps people alive. She walked away, leaving Rachel alone with the window and the darkness. Rachel thought about her words for a long time, paying attention in ways most people don't, seeing things most people miss. That was the sniper's gift, the ability to read a scene, to notice anomalies, to piece together patterns that others overlooked. It was a skill she'd honed over 18 months of Overwatch and target acquisition, refined through hundreds of hours of observation and analysis. She'd tried to bury it with the rest of her past, tried to pretend that the nurse and the sniper were separate people, that she could amputate one and keep the other. But they weren't separate. They never had been. The same attention that made her a deadly sniper made her a good nurse. The same pattern recognition that let her spot concealed positions let her notice early signs of infection. The same threat assessment that calculated enemy positions calculated patient deterioration. She couldn't be one without being the other. Rachel accepted this, finally, standing at that window in FOB Mercer, not with peace, not with relief, but with the weary resignation of someone who had stopped fighting a losing battle. She was a sniper who happened to work as a nurse, and some nights, that would mean saving lives. And some nights, it would mean taking them. The scales would never balance. The ghosts would never stop following. But she would keep going anyway. Not because she wanted to, but because the alternative was worse. The morning shift arrived at 0600. Rachel handed off her patients, updated the charts, and walked to the temporary quarters she'd been assigned. A shipping container with a cot and a footlocker. Home, for now. She lay down and closed her eyes. Sleep came slowly, as it always did. And when it came, the dreams came with it. Hamid Khalil, falling in the street with his daughter's screams echoing behind him. The Overwatch, collapsing in the snow with a 30-meter hole in his chest. 48 ghosts, crowding around her in the darkness, asking the questions she couldn't answer. Rachel let them come, let them speak, let them demand their accounting. She had no answers for them, no justifications, no redemption to offer. All she had was the work, the patience she would save tomorrow, the lives she would preserve because she was still capable of preservation. It wasn't enough. It would never be enough, but it was something, and something was better than nothing. Rachel slept, and the ghosts kept watch beside her. 3 weeks into her assignment at FOB Mercer, Rachel was on duty when a medevac helicopter brought in a sniper team. 2 operators, both wounded. Their spotter had taken shrapnel to the chest. Serious but survivable. Their shooter had a through-and-through round to the thigh that had nicked the femoral artery. Rachel worked on the shooter while Dr. Chin handled the spotter. He was young, mid-20s at most. Dog tags read Sullivan Marcus J. His MOS was listed on the intake form, but Rachel didn't need to read it. She could tell by the way he held himself, even semi-conscious. The controlled breathing, the deliberate stillness. She knew that posture. She'd lived with it for 18 months. "You're going to be fine," she said, applying pressure to the wound while Chen's team prepped the surgical suite. "Clean exit. We'll get the bleeder stopped and have you back on your feet in a week." Sullivan's eyes focused on her face. Sharp, even through the pain medication. "You military?" "Former." "What branch?" Rachel hesitated. "Marines." "Mo's." She didn't answer, just kept working on his leg, professional and efficient. Sullivan watched her for a long moment. Then his eyes dropped to her hands. The way she was holding the pressure, the angle of her grip, the precise positioning that came from muscle memory, not textbook training. "You're a shooter," he said softly. "The way you're holding that, that's how you'd hold a rifle stock. Same grip, same pressure." Rachel's hands didn't waver. "I'm a nurse." "You're both." Sullivan's voice was fading as the sedatives took hold. "I can tell. Takes one to know one." His eyes closed, his breathing slowed. Rachel finished stabilizing the wound and stepped back. Dr. Chin appeared beside her. "He's stable. We'll take it from here." Rachel nodded and turned to leave. "Brennan." Chen's voice stopped her. "He's right, isn't he? About what you used to be?" Rachel looked at the young sniper on the table. 25 years old, maybe, doing the same job she'd done, carrying the same weight she carried. "It doesn't matter what I used to be," she said. "What matters is what I am now." "And what's that?" Rachel thought about the question for a long moment. Someone who keeps people alive. She walked out of the surgical suite and didn't look back. Sullivan recovered quickly. Military tough, like most snipers. He was ambulatory within 3 days and was pushing for a return to duty by the end of the first week. Rachel checked on him during her rounds, the same as she checked on all her patients. Professional, efficient, detached. But he watched her with different eyes than the other patients. Knowing eyes. "I asked around about you," he said on the 5th day. "Nurse Brennan, former Marine, classified discharge. You shouldn't have done that." "Probably not." Sullivan shifted on his cot, favoring his wounded leg. "But I was curious. A nurse with shooter's grip doesn't come along every day. I'm just a nurse. And I'm just a sniper." Sullivan's smile was tired but genuine. "Except we both know that's not true. You don't stop being what you are just because you change jobs." Rachel didn't respond. "I heard about FOB Kestrel." Sullivan's voice dropped. "The insurgent assault. 26 patients survived when they should have been massacred. I hid in a supply closet." "No, you didn't." Sullivan met her gaze. "I've read casualty reports from soft target attacks. I know what usually happens. 26 survivors from an 8-man assault in a blizzard isn't luck. It's skill. Rachel turned to leave. Brennan, Sullivan's voice stopped her. Whoever you used to be, thank you for what you did, for the people you saved. Rachel paused at the door. I didn't save them, she said quietly. I just did what needed to be done. That's the same thing. Sullivan settled back against his pillow. That's always the same thing. Rachel walked out without responding, but his words stayed with her. Through her shift, through her rounds, through the long hours of the night, when the ghosts came calling. That's the same thing. That's always the same thing. Maybe he was right. Maybe doing what needed to be done, even when it cost you everything, even when it broke every promise you'd made to yourself. Maybe that was its own kind of salvation, not redemption, not absolution, but purpose. Rachel finished her shift at 0600 and walked to the eastern perimeter of the facility. The sun was rising over the mountains, painting the sky in shades of orange and gold. She stood there for a long time, watching the light spread across the valley. 48 ghosts walked beside her. Hamid Khalil, the Overwatch in the snow, all the others who had fallen to her bullets over 18 months of professional killing. They would always be there. She understood that now. They couldn't be bought off with good deeds or balanced with saved lives. They were permanent companions, as much a part of her as the sniper training she couldn't unlearn. But the 26 patients from FOB Kestrel were alive this morning. Private Chin was writing letters to his sister. Sergeant Morrison was relearning to walk after his surgery. Corporal Williams had seen his daughter's face on a video call for the first time in 6 months. They were alive because she had done what needed to be done. The scales didn't balance. They never would, but the work continued. It always would. Rachel turned away from the sunrise and walked back toward the facility. She had another shift starting at 2200. More patients to check. More lives to preserve. More proof that she was still capable of choosing preservation over destruction. She was a sniper who happened to work as a nurse. She was a killer who had chosen to heal. She was Rachel Brennan, and she would carry both identities until the day she died. Not because she had resolved the conflict, but because she had accepted that it would never be resolved. Some days would demand sutures. Some days would demand bullets. And she would answer both calls, because that was who she was. Not the woman she'd built. Not the woman she'd been born as. Something new. Something integrated. Something that held both true simultaneously, without pretending either canceled out the other. Rachel walked through the door of FOB Mercer and began her morning routine. The ghosts walked beside her. The scales remained unbalanced. The work continued. It always would. 6 months later, Rachel received a letter. It was hand-delivered by a Marine corporal who didn't know what it contained. The envelope was plain white with no return address. Inside was a single photograph and a handwritten note. The photograph showed a young woman, 15, maybe 16, standing in front of a school building. She was wearing a blue headscarf and carrying textbooks. Her face was serious, but her eyes were bright. The note was written in careful English. My name is Amira Khalil. My father was Hamid Khalil. I know what happened to him. I know who killed him. I learned your name from records that were declassified last month. I wanted to hate you. For 3 years, I tried to hate you. But I am 15 now, and I understand things I did not understand when I was 7. You were told my father was an enemy. You believed the people who told you. You did what soldiers do. It was wrong, but it was not your fault alone. I'm going to be a doctor. I am going to save lives, like you tried to do after you left the military. I learned this about you from the same records. I did not forgive you. I cannot forgive you. But I understand you, and I wanted you to know that I am alive. I am going to school. I am going to help people. My father would have wanted me to tell you this. He believed in second chances. Amira. Rachel read the letter 3 times. Then she folded it carefully, placed it back in the envelope, and put it in the footlocker beside her cot. She sat on the edge of the cot for a long time, staring at nothing. Amira Khalil was 15 years old. She was going to be a doctor. She was alive and she was studying, and she understood things she hadn't understood when she was 7 years old and covered in her father's blood. She did not forgive. She could not forgive, but she understood. Rachel had spent 3 years believing that understanding was impossible. that what she had done was beyond comprehension, beyond explanation, beyond any framework that could contain it. But a 15-year-old girl had found a way to understand, had found a way to move forward, had found a way to transform tragedy into purpose. Rachel let out a long, slow breath. The scales didn't balance. They never would. But maybe there was something beyond balance. Something that existed in the space between forgiveness and forgetting. Something that allowed two people, connected by violence and loss, to both keep moving forward. Rachel stood up and walked to the window. The sun was setting over the mountains. Another day ending. Another shift beginning. She had patients to check, vitals to monitor, lives to preserve. The work continued. It always would. But tonight, for the first time in 3 years, Rachel felt something shift inside her chest. Not peace, not resolution, but something that might, with time, grow into acceptance. She was a sniper who happened to work as a nurse. She was a killer who had chosen to heal. She was carrying 48 ghosts and 26 saved lives, and one letter from a girl who understood things that shouldn't be understandable. And she would keep carrying them, all of them, forever, not because she wanted to, but because the alternative was worse. Rachel walked out of her quarters and headed toward the medical ward. The night shift was starting. Patients needed her attention. The work needed her hands. She was ready. She would always be ready. That was the burden and the blessing of being who she was, a woman with two identities that could never be separated, two purposes that could never be reconciled, two paths that led to the same destination: preservation, destruction, healing, killing. All of it was her. All of it would always be her. Rachel pushed open the door to the ward and began her rounds. The ghosts walked beside her. The scales remained unbalanced. The work continued. And somewhere, in a school half a world away, a 15-year-old girl was studying to become a doctor. The scales didn't balance. But maybe in the end they weren't supposed to.